This is the image they never wanted you to see. A map of the United States, Mexico's southern border ignited in red with fentanyl seizures, while the Canadian line sits eerily blank. The entire Canada fentanyl crisis narrative? It just drove straight off a cliff. In a dramatic move, Donald Trump signed an executive order, weaponizing fentanyl as the pretext to impose 25% tariffs on Canada. Not steel dumping, not dairy quotas, but the claim that Canada was turning a blind eye to fentanyl flooding into the U.S. He pointed north, calling the Canadian border weak, framing tariffs as a desperate defense against poison streaming from the wrong side of the map. If you're Canadian, you feel the sting. One day you wake up in a nation that stood shoulder to shoulder with America on border security, only to suddenly be painted as a drug pipeline. Your businesses pay the price. Your exports are hit hard. Your economy suffers because of a lie you know deep down isn't true. This isn't just another politician's exaggeration. This is unprecedented. For the first time, a U.S. president used a fabricated drug crisis to justify a trade war against a trusted ally, even as his own agencies reported a very different truth. Almost all the fentanyl being seized at the U.S. border is coming from Mexico, not Canada. And that matters, not just because it's unjust, but because it sets a dangerous precedent. If you can create a drug threat to punish a friend today, you can use that same trick to target anyone tomorrow. It's not just about Canada's image. It's about what kind of world we live in when facts no longer matter. Here's the plan. Over the next few minutes, we're going to peel back the curtain on the real fentanyl seizure data from U.S. Customs and Border Protection and the DEA, examining both the northern and southern borders. We'll track the true journey of fentanyl and its precursor chemicals, from China's factories to Mexican cartels' labs to the streets of America. And then, we'll hold that up against Executive Order Ward Team 193, alongside the narrative that painted Canada as the villain, an entire story that simply doesn't stand up to the numbers. By the end, you'll walk away with 3 key numbers and 1 mental map, tools you can use in any conversation, on any show, or in any comment section, to effortlessly dismantle the phrase, "Canada is sending fentanyl," without ever raising your voice. Let's tackle the most basic question. Where is the fentanyl actually coming from? You've heard the claim, fentanyl is flooding in from the north. Canada can't control its border. It sounds convincing, if you're only listening to sound bites from a podium. But the moment you look at the actual seizures, the entire story collapses. The truth is brutally clear. Year after year, U.S. data shows that almost all the fentanyl seized at the border comes from the southwest border with Mexico. Depending on the year, anywhere from 96 to 99% of the total weight is caught there. The northern border with Canada? Less than 1%. In one particularly telling year, U.S. Customs and Border Protection seized just 43 pounds of fentanyl at the northern border, while tens of thousands of pounds were seized at the southern border. Researchers at the Manhattan Institute dove deeper into large seizures near the borders, and their findings are stark. Around 97% of fentanyl powder and nearly 99% of fentanyl pills were seized at or near the Mexico border. The Canadian border barely registers, somewhere between 0.5 and 2.7% by weight in some samples, and close to 0 in others. Picture this. If you divided the entire map of fentanyl seizures into 100 dots, at least 96 of those dots would land on the Mexican border. Canada's share would fit into a single dot, and in some years it wouldn't even color that dot. This isn't Canadian propaganda. These are the facts U.S. law enforcement and independent analysts are publishing. So when you see a map with the south ablaze and the north nearly empty, don't mistake that for an opinion. That's just math. Why does it look like that? Because of how fentanyl actually moves. Think of fentanyl as a dark river. The rain that feeds it is the precursor chemicals, mostly made in China, with some from India. These chemicals flow into clandestine labs in Mexico, where cartels like Sinaloa and CJNG transform them into finished fentanyl powder and counterfeit pills. Then, it crosses into the U.S. through the southwest border, mostly through ports of entry, often hidden in vehicles driven by U.S. citizens. China is the chemical rain. Mexico is the lab. The southwest border is the main conduit for the flow into the U.S.-Canada. It's a tiny puddle at the edge of the map. When you misinterpret that map, the consequences stretch far beyond mere rhetoric. Convince the public that Canada is the primary source of fentanyl, And you can sell tariffs on an ally as a righteous fight against drugs, despite the fact that the true drug pipeline runs almost entirely in the opposite direction. You can redirect limited enforcement resources to a border where fentanyl seizures are scarce, diverting attention from the ports and corridors your own threat assessments identify as critical. And you can damage a vital relationship with a neighbor crucial in the fight against organized crime, all while leaving the heart of the problem untouched. Picture a border agent in Montana, stationed on the northern frontier. He spends entire shifts without encountering a major fentanyl bust. The largest fines are minuscule, often just personal use, if anything at all. Meanwhile, his counterparts in San Diego and Nogales are slicing open vehicles stuffed with pills, seizing tons of fentanyl, raiding stash houses tied to Mexican cartels. Yet when he switches on the news at night, he hears that the crisis is coming from the north, with Canada blamed. This gap between the data and where the finger points? That's where politics takes hold. Now, let's uncover how fentanyl became the perfect cover story for tariffs. The narrative many heard was simple. We need tariffs because Canada is flooding America with fentanyl. It seems like a straightforward cause and effect relationship. But when you examine the executive order and compare it with the seizure data, a far different story emerges. Executive Order 14193 frames Canada's so-called failure to control fentanyl as a national security threat, using that framework to justify 25% tariffs on a broad range of Canadian goods. The language emphasizes protecting Americans from deadly drugs, yet simultaneously, data from CBP and the DEA during the same period show that roughly 98 to 99% of fentanyl seizures at U.S. borders happened at the southern border. The northern border's seizures? Still under 1%. That mismatch is glaring. On one side, you have an order targeting Canada under a drug rationale. On the other, you have charts that show the crisis centered almost entirely on a different border. BBC reports and U.S. data aggregators reveal that over 96% of border seizures occur at the southwest border, with the northern border barely showing up at all. In this context, fentanyl doesn't look like the real target. It's the packaging for something far bigger. It's politically simpler to say, I'm protecting your family from Canadian fentanyl, than to admit, I'm using tariffs to extract a trade concession from an ally. Framing a trade move in the language of drugs and crime carries an emotional punch that neutral terms like market access could never achieve. Canada is the perfect scapegoat for this narrative. It's easier to criticize soft Canadian enforcement than to confront the brutal realities of Mexican cartels or the complexities of Chinese chemical control. You can sound tough on drugs without acknowledging that the real solution demands cooperation with countries your base may distrust. But when you base policy on a narrative that doesn't align with your own data, the fallout is inevitable. The impact of tariffs on Canadian exports was immediate and severe. Within just months, Canadian exports to the U.S. plummeted, with entire categories dropping by double digits from their previous highs. Factories tied to U.S. contracts froze hiring, canceled investments, and slashed shifts. The looming fear of a broader economic downturn, already exacerbated by other trade measures, only deepened. Canada struck back with its own tariffs, consumer boycotts surged, and cross-border travel dipped as ordinary Canadians, stung by accusations of fueling a deadly drug epidemic, decided to spend their money elsewhere. Trust, already frayed by inflammatory rhetoric, took another major hit. And what about the fentanyl flow? The core supply chain, from Chinese precursors to Mexican labs to U.S. markets, remained largely untouched. The DEA's National Drug Threat Assessment continued to point to Mexico as the dominant source of illicit fentanyl, with China as a key supplier of precursor chemicals and finished products in some periods. There's no indication that the tariffs on Canada led to any noticeable drop in overdose deaths, because the real pipeline was never affected. Imagine a family in Ontario working at a plant that manufactures equipment for U.S. clients. When tariffs hit, their biggest customer pulls back. Orders vanish. Layoffs begin. They hear the reason from Washington. Canada hasn't done enough to curb fentanyl entering the U.S. Then they look at the DEA maps where the Canadian border barely shows up in the seizure data. For them, this isn't some abstract debate. It's a lost paycheck attached to a story that doesn't hold up under scrutiny. At this point, a fair question to ask is, what are Canadians and their allies supposed to do with all this? Enter the ammo pack. The myth you often hear in family debates and comment sections is simple. The United States is just defending itself. Canada can't control its fentanyl problem, so tariffs are justified. It casts Canada as either negligent or complicit. But the reality is clear. Fentanyl at the U.S. border is overwhelmingly a southern border and global supply chain issue, not a northern one. DEA reports consistently describe illicit fentanyl as largely produced in Mexico, using chemicals imported from China, and smuggled mainly through the southwest border and U.S. mail and shipping routes, not via Canadian crossings. In fact, Canadian and U.S. agencies cooperate extensively on cross-border crime, including drug trafficking, and while northern seizures exist, they are minuscule compared to the volumes seen on the southern border. So what are the 3 key numbers you need? First, the border split. A staggering 96 to 99% of fentanyl seized at U.S. borders is caught at or near the Mexican border. Less than 1% is seized at the Canadian border. That's the single most crucial number you need to keep in mind. Second, the sources. The DEA and independent analysts like Brookings and the Council on Foreign Relations have consistently pointed to China and Mexico as the key players in the fentanyl supply chain. China supplies the precursor chemicals and some finished products, while Mexico handles the large-scale synthesis and trafficking into the U.S. Canada doesn't even register as a major producer in these assessments. Third, the mismatch between the executive order and the data. Executive Order 191-193 targets Canada under the guise of fighting fentanyl, yet the seizure and threat assessments released by U.S. agencies in the same timeframe consistently highlight Mexico and global chemical flows as the real bottlenecks. How do you bring this up in a real conversation? If you're sitting across from a relative in the U.S. who insists Canada is to blame for flooding America with fentanyl, you don't need to deliver a lecture. Just show them a picture and ask one simple question. Pull up the map of border seizures, with the south glowing in red and the north almost untouched. Read one line aloud. Less than 1% of border fentanyl seizures happen at the Canadian border, according to CBP and DEA data. Then ask, if 90+% is coming through Mexico, why are tariffs aimed at Canada? Online, the logic is the same. Instead of arguing emotions against emotions, post a simple sentence. CBP and DEA data show 96–99% of fentanyl seizures happen at the Mexico border, and less than 1% at the Canadian border. Blaming Canada ignores the math. That one line shifts the conversation from slogans to solid evidence. When more Canadians and allies start using these same key numbers, something significant happens. The feeling of being gaslit starts to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence rooted in facts. Media outlets and officials who wish to maintain credibility will be forced to adjust their language or risk being publicly corrected with their own government's data. Over time, the narrative shifts from Canada as the problem to Canada as the partner, a shift closer to the truth. Now, imagine the next holiday dinner when this comes up. Someone says, well, Canada is sending fentanyl, so what choice does the U.S. have? You don't get angry. You simply pull out a map on your phone. You point to the southwest border, lit up in red, and the northern border barely registering. For a few seconds, no one speaks. That silence is the sound of a story crashing into a wall of facts. What happens next? Over the next 30 to 90 days, there are at least 3 possible outcomes. In the first scenario, the lie hardens. Trump and his allies continue to repeat Canada fentanyl in interviews and rallies, no matter how many fact checks emerge. Executive Order 14193 stays in place, unchanged, with the same language targeting Canada. Right-leaning outlets continue to echo the rhetoric. The more the claim is challenged, the more it gets repeated, signaling defiance. The longer this goes on, the harder it becomes to dislodge the narrative from the minds of a core base that's heard it over and over. In the second scenario, the data breakthrough. Mainstream outlets continue to emphasize that 96% or more of fentanyl seizures occur at the Mexico border, and less than 1% at the Canadian border, as BBC, CNN, and nonpartisan aggregators have already begun to highlight. Seizure maps and charts start appearing on cable news chyrons. Under pressure, more politicians begin to avoid directly blaming Canada, even if they don't fully retract previous statements. The public justification for using fentanyl to support tariffs weakens, though the tariffs may still remain for other reasons. In the third scenario, a quiet walkback occurs. No apologies, no admissions of fault. The words Canada and fentanyl simply vanish from public discourse. Future speeches pivot to talking about foreign fentanyl or global drug traffickers, and the spotlight shifts to China and Mexico without ever acknowledging that the original narrative was flawed. The executive order remains in place, but the rhetoric morphs. So, what do we know for sure right now? We know the order exists, using Canada's supposed failure to curb fentanyl as its justification. We know from U.S. Border and Drug Agency data that nearly all fentanyl seizures occur at the southern border, not the northern one. What we don't yet know is whether continued fact-checking and public pressure will force a shift in the rhetoric or policy, or if the gap between the narrative and the facts will just remain untouched. Looking at the bigger picture, the implications extend beyond just Canada and the U.S. For Canada, being blamed for a crisis your neighbor's own data does not attribute to you adds another wound to an already growing list. Tariffs, talk of annexation, threats regarding energy, and now a drug crisis story that doesn't align with the numbers. It strengthens the push many Canadians already feel to reduce reliance on the U.S., diversify trade, and approach their southern neighbor with more caution in both security and intelligence matters. For the United States, each time political messaging blatantly diverges from the government's own data, public trust in institutions takes another blow. The DEA and CBP publish detailed assessments that make it clear the problem is here, yet the political focus continues to shift elsewhere. People who pay attention to the numbers learn a key lesson. You can't always trust that what's said from the podium reflects what's known within the system. For other allies, the pattern is concerning. If a country with America's close history and proximity can wake up one day and find itself branded a fentanyl threat based on flimsy evidence, who's to say that any nation is safe from being cast in the same role when it becomes politically convenient? Using national security or drug crisis as a flexible tool to justify tariffs, quotas, or partial decoupling isn't a one-time tactic. It's a weapon that can be wielded repeatedly. So what does this mean for you, concretely? If you're a Canadian trying to explain this to friends, colleagues, or relatives in the U.S., there are 3 key points to remember. First, about 96 to 99% of fentanyl seizures occur at or near the Mexican border, with less than 1% at the Canadian border. Second, U.S. threat assessments identify China and Mexico as the primary external sources in the fentanyl supply chain, with China supplying precursor chemicals and Mexico handling large-scale production and trafficking, not Canada. Third, the language of Executive Order Wart Team 193 and similar statements simply doesn't match the distribution of fentanyl seizures. In conversations, keep it straightforward. Don't get bogged down in emotional arguments. Just ask, if almost all of the seized fentanyl is coming through Mexico, why are we punishing Canada? That question forces the burden of proof back where it belongs. For those working in policy, advocacy, or journalism, there are a few things to keep an eye on. The DEA's latest National Drug Threat Assessment and monthly seizure statistics give you solid data to compare with political claims. Pay attention to new executive orders and official speeches to see whether Canada is still being explicitly blamed for fentanyl, or if the language starts shifting toward more accurate, broader terms. If you take on this task, your job is to demand citations when officials point fingers at specific countries, and to present maps and data to your audience, rather than just repeating quotes. If you're in the U.S. and genuinely concerned about the fentanyl crisis, the reality is blunt. Effective crackdowns need to target the real pipeline: Mexican labs and trafficking networks, Chinese and other precursor chemical flows, and the demand and treatment systems within the U.S. tariffs on Canada don't change those fundamentals. They don't shut down a single lab in Sinaloa. They don't intercept shipments of precursors leaving Chinese ports. They don't expand addiction treatment in U.S. cities. This isn't to say there's nothing worth supporting. It means that energy and focus need to be directed toward policies that actually address enforcement, regulation, and intelligence sharing with Mexico and China, and toward domestic strategies that reduce demand and harm. And it means remaining skeptical of any leader who keeps pointing to the wrong border. So, where does that leave us? We've uncovered 3 layers of this story: the fentanyl flow map that shows where the problem actually lies, the tariff cover story that repackaged the crisis to justify a trade move against an ally, and the Canadian ammo pack, the set of facts you can bring into any conversation to reset it on solid ground. The core point is clear. Blaming Canada for America's fentanyl crisis isn't just an error. It's a deliberate political framing that directly contradicts U.S. government data and carries real economic and diplomatic consequences. If you want a lasting image, here it is. Blaming Canada for fentanyl is like blaming firefighters because your house burned down, simply because they were the ones closest when the cameras rolled. Or, to put it another way, it's like trying to cure cancer by smashing the mirror. The tumor's elsewhere. The mirror is just reflecting what you refuse to see. So here's what I want to hear from you. Why do you think a president chose to target an almost uninvolved ally instead of focusing on the Mexican labs and Chinese chemical flows that his own agencies point to? Do you think there's any way back to a data-driven drug policy once such a narrative takes hold? And would you rather live in a country where trade and security decisions are based on numbers or on stories that just happen to poll well? Leave a comment with your thoughts, your data, or your experiences from either side of the border. Those are the voices that truly shift the conversation.